Hello again. Welcome to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Today we have a special guest, Farahn Morgan. How's it going, Farahn?
Good. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be
Cool.
here.
Yeah, well, your account kind of just came across my radar. We had become mutuals and liked some of each other's posts, and I was, a lot of your posts I really appreciate are just very Appalachian. You just like, exude kind of an appreciation and a love for Appalachian culture and being from this region. And I just thought I'd get you on and talk about it. Also, you're in, the news business, I guess, or the reporter. You're a news reporter or a story reporter. So that's also very interesting. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of things to talk about here. On your profile, you say Appalachian localist. That also resonates a lot with me. And so, yeah, so why don't we go ahead and start by, if you want to just introduce yourself, your background, whatever you want to say,
Yeah.
and, what I guess Appalachia and localism mean to you.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for saying that. That's high praise. I love where I'm from. I grew up in Southwestern Virginia on the Tennessee-Kentucky border. And what some people call Central Appalachia, some people call it Southern Appalachia. I guess it
That's
depends on
close.
how you define
Right.
Appalachia and
Right.
its
Yeah.
boundaries. It's definitely, we call it kind of the heart of Appalachia, and we tend to be very precious about it just because we're in this moment when there's so much interest in Appalachia and what Appalachia is, what it means,
Yeah.
sort of what it has to offer the outside world. That I think we all do a fair bit of gatekeeping. I myself am very guilty of gatekeeping when it comes to sort of not just geographic boundaries, but sort of our ways.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm sure that's true. Appalachia is special to me because it's my home, but I think that you know. I hope that and I believe that any place that anybody is from, if they're from the Bronx, if they're from, California, God forbid, that's a special place to them that they love. My friend Lori Briscoe, who is a wild crafter, she owns a teas and botanical companies here, but she calls it being made of place.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
that's really how I feel about home. Um, and I have some perspective because I grew up here and, was really deeply connected, not just to place, but sort of my family via place. Um, but I moved away. I lived in DC for 10 years and worked in communications and, as you mentioned, media. And so I really am like so grateful for this, but I have the benefit of sort of having an external view as well. And I chose to come home and didn't really know what I would do professionally maybe 2.5 years ago. I guess actually almost 3 years ago now. It's all the time, all the COVID times running together. Um, but for me, it was really about coming home to my family. And I think when you grow up Appalachian, you have a birthright to something that's really special. And a lot of that has to do with not just survival of the region, but survival of people. There have been times in our history, and there are still people here now for whom food insecurity is a big question. Um, and so, I think what's come of that is this really beautiful, rich culture where people try to live as symbiotically as they can with the land and, to understand it, to understand their place in relation to it. And, it is a place of abundance. If you are in need you know, and you have to be sort of, creative, find different ways to survive and live, it's a place that'll allow you to do that. And I think, for a lot of people, that rootedness in place comes from that abundance and sense of, you might not have anything and yet you have everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I have to admit, so I've lived in Appalachia, Southern Appalachia, for about 4 years. So I'm an outsider, and I'm trying not to be a jerk about it. I know that there's a lot of people moving in here, especially like wealthy people, say from Florida or Charleston or something. They have their second or third home. I work part-time doing landscaping, and so I work at a lot of these homes where like they're there for like 3 months out of the year, and probably from Florida or Charleston or somewhere like that. And it raises the property values, it raises property tax, it prices people out, especially locals, it prices them out, especially with the property tax. And so I can understand how it would be frustrating, one of like wanting to preserve your culture, but then also it being very attractive to outsiders of like, a lot of people have a lot of images of Appalachia, whether it's like, whether they see it as quote poor white trash or whether they see it as like this like folk, nexus where like the real kind of roots are being planted and cultivated and like everything in between. And so people have all these images of Appalachia coming in.
Yeah.
You want to talk about kind of this dynamic of like the perceptions of Appalachia from the outside. I mean, DC, it'd be fascinating to get what your impression of their perspective was of Appalachia, but then also like what it's doing in kind of terms of political economy and right and wrong ways for people to come here. Because I'm new. I've traveled around. I feel like I mostly grew up in northern New Mexico. That feels somewhat like home, but not. But when I came here, I felt like I had really come home. But again, I don't have family here, so
Good. I'm glad.
It's an ongoing
Yeah.
question for me about like my identity here and all of that.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I think I've seen right and wrong ways to sort of come to Appalachia,
Yeah.
or what I would consider right and wrong ways. I think about, somebody who came and in my view did it in the quote unquote right way is this guy. His name's Mike O'Donnell, who's a professor at University of Virginia at Wise, used to be Clinch Valley College. And he taught French, and he's this like very fast talking, profane, Irish Catholic dude from I can't remember. He's definitely from Pennsylvania, but I can't remember whether he's from Philly or Pittsburgh. I know Pittsburgh is meant to be like the Paris of Appalachia. I don't think anybody where I'm from would consider Pittsburgh Appalachia at all. So it's like Appalachia connected and shares
Yeah.
a lot of culture, but also very, very different from where I'm from.
Mm-hmm.
But I think about everybody calls him OD. I think about OD, and he is like this world traveled dude who, doesn't really fit in a lot of ways, but is so respectful and has so much genuine love and care for the people and the culture. And maybe it's because he's so well traveled in a way that he, doesn't have this view that he's here to impose what he's experienced in life on the place. He's sort of, here to enjoy it, to sort of nurture students. Where they're open to and want to be nurtured, and to really just to love. I mean, that's the core thing, right? Is that if you come in and you don't have empathy for people and you don't have empathy for place and you see it as a place that needs saving or a place to be exploited, then you're not going to have a good time here. People are not going to receive you well. They're not going to want you here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I listened to the episode that you guys did with Chris Arnade, and he said like just shut the F up for 5 years.
Yeah.
And I thought that was such a good point because it is. I mean, it's really like it's really like going to somebody's house. Somebody invites you to their home for a meal, or to spend time with them. Very few people would just like show up and say like, oh, you shouldn't make your food that way, or your kitchen would look a lot better if you did this. Like that's what it can feel like if there's not sort of that mutual respect and understanding. I think another part of it is this dichotomy that's been created, and I think this is probably over discussed on Twitter, but I think it's it's very real. This like concept of credentialed expertise as opposed to like experiential expertise that when you come into a place, especially here, like I think about some of the women that I've met who still hand quilt and make like wild, elaborate, like stunning quilts.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if you went to a folk school for a week, you're not the expert on that. You know,
Yeah.
if you graduated with a fine arts degree, it doesn't matter. You're still not the expert on that. Like, this is a woman, you know, these are women who've been doing this as a function of survival, as a function of like love and care and wanting people to have something that's, you know, both beautiful and functional.
Yeah.
So maybe listen and acknowledge, you know, that expertise instead of, you know, convincing yourself that your way of knowing is the only way of knowing.
Yeah.
Um, but again, that's true. You know, I don't think that's just true of Appalachia. I think it's true of, you know, of every place that, you know, if you if it's like standing in the middle of the subway platform, if you're in a city, like just don't do it, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it really is rooted in love and just like loving people and showing sort of charity and openness and empathy for people.
Mm. Yeah, well, I think this topic you brought up of like expertise is a really important topic that we can maybe dig into more. I mean, we talk about on this podcast a lot about kind of spreadsheet brain of like kind of the technocratic class, you can say. And full disclosure, like in my grad school, I was basically being trained to be a technocrat in economics, and I've kind of turned against that path and became disillusioned with it. But it's this idea that, okay, I can go do a survey and, you know, of some place and then crunch some numbers and then have an understanding of what the core drivers are and what good policy prescriptions are. And the same going with like expertise, like how do you, you know, yeah, going to a folk school for a week does not make you an expert.
Yeah.
Can we talk about kind of like, I mean, the way I kind of frame it is kind of knowledge from the inside out versus knowledge from kind of the outside in. And
Yeah.
both are okay, but oftentimes the people who carry knowledge from the outside in are very arrogant about it and are
Yeah.
actually missing a lot because they don't have that real embodied connection over lifetimes and generations. Do you want to just expound more on that? I think that's a really
Yeah.
thing.
I mean it's I think so. My education background, I studied philosophy in undergrad at Wake Forest, and then I went to law school at Wake Forest for love, not for money. I never thought I would practice. I just was like, you know, head in the clouds.
Yeah.
Maybe I need something to bring me back down to earth. View of that experience. But you know, I was speaking from personal experience. I was that person. I was the person who was like, well, you know, I have this outside experience. You know, I have these degrees. You know, wrote an honors thesis in philosophy. Like I'm fancy, you know, which is like um, almost an immature, and I think it is born in youth and sort of immaturity way of viewing yourself and viewing, you know, both knowledge and wisdom. I had this when I first came back, I had this really humbling experience when my uncle's friend, who's nicknamed Hatchet, asked me to do something on my uncle's farm, and I had like no clue, and it was so simple, like it was the simplest thing. Um, and I must have looked kind of stunned, but you know, I stood there and I said, Hatchet, I need you to show me how to do this. And he said, what'd you do, honey? College? And I was like,
You learn it in college.
oh, oh,
uh,
but valid. But I do think, you know, the spreadsheet brain thing, I've had a lot of conversations with folks in political circles about this because, you know, I know all of these folks who work on campaigns and work, you know, work in practical politics, and their view does tend to be like, this is what the data is telling us. And so what the data is telling us is God, like that is God.
yeah.
And it's so funny here too, because people make jokes about like avoiding the census man. So like, if you
Right.
think about people who like don't want to participate, you know, as like a tongue-in-cheek joke, but that is kind of our way. Like people are so sort of skeptical of outside power, outside influences that they don't want to participate.
Justifiably.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Then you're not just not getting a full picture. You're not getting any picture of those people at all. Like they're not even included in that information. But you know, to the extent that people do participate and that, you know, you can gather some data, it's really like it's a matter of it's imprecise quantitative data
Mhm.
rather than sort of the fact of wholeness and the fact of, I mean, again, like, I'm using abundance in a different way, but abundance, personal abundance.
Mhm.
Um, I think this is like this, I'm moving back toward my head in the clouds phase, but I would use the word fantastical. Like, if you have a conversation with somebody, um, they might not be anything like you. They might not have anything in common with you. And hopefully they don't, because that's the most, interesting conversation.
Mhm.
But you will find something in them that you understand in yourself.
Yeah.
And I think in everything, that's sort of the point, that the place that we're in. It's not sort of just politics, it's not sort of economics or political analysis. It's art, it's marketing, it's everything. It's this like insistence on incuriosity about people,
Right.
and about the world that we live in. I think you know the other part of it is that, like, we're in this place, and I guess this is kind of the doomer part of the podcast, but like, we're in this place where people don't feel good. Really, nobody feels good. Like, right and left, everybody is exhausted, everybody's angry or anxious or whatever, um, concerned about, about whether they're going to have enough, whether, think the market's going to bottom out, whatever it is that people are worried about. But when you think about generational knowledge, like, they've been through that. Like, they've seen that. They understand how to face it. I think about my dad when I first moved home, and I was contracting a little bit, doing sort of communications and PR stuff. And, COVID happened, and I was like, holy shit, nobody's going to want PR services. Like, that's the most inane, like, you do not need that if you're worried about money. And my dad was like, well, baby, can you eat soup beans? Like, you're gonna be fine. Like, you will eat and you will be fine. Um, and I think we lack that perspective, and we reject that perspective to our own detriment.
Mhm.
Um, and I feel like I just feel really so grateful for what I've found here, and especially the older generation. Um, they're just so really, they're like dying to share what they know, and they feel like people aren't interested in what they have to say, but they're, these people are geniuses.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Anything that you need, they've got it.
Right. Right.
And it's true, not just in terms of like practical knowledge, but wisdom too. Like, if you're suffering or struggling in your heart, and you're worried or you're anxious, they have a remedy for that. Like, it's kind of to our own impoverishment that we reject that, and seek out people who look exactly like us.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this, I think, speaks to a general theme of like the importance of connection to place and
Yeah.
connection to, other people who are also of that place. This is also kind of a common theme, so it's not breaking any ground here, but there's a lot of talk about how we've kind of outsourced all of our, say, community autonomy to either the market or the state, right? One or
Yeah.
the other. And like, if it's to the state, then the government's going to provide, all of our goods, and we're going to depend on the government. If it's the state, then we're just going to get all of our food from the supermarkets, or it's going to show up at our front door on Amazon or something. And people who advocate, like, to say, argue this is a good thing, is like, oh, it's efficient and look at all this material wealth we have. But in many ways, one is very fragile, because the state you can have a regime change, it could turn against your interests, the market can crash, and what do you have left if you've become wholly reliant on those things, and you haven't actually been carrying on these traditions of people learning how to live with very few external means, but learning how to live well, right, in their own way. Like, if you lose that, like, everything's been hollowed out. And I think that's kind of, let's just say, American society today, that's kind of where we are, where a lot of cultures around the country have been hollowed out, and a lot of the material conditions are getting very hard for people, but there's no fallback, right? There's nothing to fall back on. And it's wonderful that you still have this living tradition that can help guide you, and a lot of people don't have that, and
Yeah.
it's incredibly sad.
Yeah. And I do think, I mean, there's always a tension Because, I think anytime, and I think this has been true for generations, and in a way, I think, and I really am not of the, Appalachia as victim mindset whatsoever. I think, you mentioned efficiency. Efficiency, I think, is at tension with resilience. And, the way that people do things here, there's a kind of efficiency to it. It's kind of an internal efficiency. But it's really about, what can be sustained over time. And it is a generational way of thinking. It's not sort of, make as much or earn as much or whatever, as we can, as quick as we can. It's really about like, okay, I'm going to need to come back to this next year. I'm going to need to come back to this in 10 years. Okay, I want my kids to be able to come back to this. But there is a tension. And I think a lot of the tension is sort of a political tension. And, this area in particular, it's been hyper dependent on coal. And, in the absence of coal, it's been really, really, really hard for people. But there was a time before coal existed, and I'm not saying that people lived well. In fact, I know that they didn't. I know that my family didn't. Um, but I am saying that there's a way, and there's a view internally, that help is coming, and no help is coming. For this area in particular, no help has ever really come. Um, and I think that older people understand that. I think that younger people, and especially people who are ambitious in politics or economics or, sort of public life, quote unquote, in the area, really have embraced this view of economic development that chafes against that, idea of sort of grit and self-determination, and, sort of small community-based sustainability. And I don't think that's worked well. And I find it really concerning, and I'm in a way fearful of it. In another way, I feel like, the market forces have the market forces here have just rejected it. So in a way, like, in a way that makes me optimistic, because it's like, hey, like, you cannot force the rest of the world on this place that is not the rest of the world. But I do think, there is this view that if you, I've experienced this myself, the view, when I left DC, there were lots of folks who I knew who were like, you're abandoning your career, you're abandoning your professional network, you're abandoning your friend network. And in some ways that was true, but that abandonment was an intentional choice. And I think it has to do with sort of, my friend says you have to show up. My Marine Corps buddy, he always says you have to show up to formation. Well, who's formation? Like, are you showing up to, formation in a world that you didn't choose, that you really don't want any part in continuing to sustain? Or do you show up for formation for your family and your friends and, the people who love you and who, if the shit hits the fan, they're the people who are going to be there. But I do think that it's a hard choice, because I think that there's so many, market and marketing forces that say, like, if you don't live this way, you're a failure. Like, if you don't participate in, this sort of like, hyper industrialization, corporatization, everything is marketing, nothing is substance world, then what you have chosen is failure. And, it is kind of a constant in your own mind. I think this constant, like, actually, I chose this, like, this is not something that I like dropped out into. Like, I'm showing up to formation, but it's the formation that I choose to show up to.
Right. And you're a journalist is that kind of your main career path? I ask because I'm very, I'm fascinated to jump into, well, one, your experience in DC, coming back, showing up to formation, making an explicit choice to be here, with your place and your family. What do you see kind of as in your journalistic capacity? Like, what is your role? Like, what stories are you trying to tell or report on? like who are you trying to speak to? Like what do you see as kind of your mission in journalism? I saw in your profile you've written for like Real Clear News. I mean, that's probably the most DC Beltway publication out there. So I'm curious like how you see your role in kind of this journalistic universe.
Yeah. Well, I've been really blessed at Real Clear, and I do some other sort of social media marketing, et cetera, things for Real Clear. But Alex Perez, who is the editor of the Books and Culture um, vertical, has been so encouraging. And I don't even know if I would call what I do journalism, although I guess it is in some form that. I think about it as storytelling
Yeah.
because I think journalism has become, there's a kind of journalism that's just events based, like what's going on. And I think I'm so tired of following what's going on. And I actually bought a few Life magazines from the late 60s, early 70s at an estate sale a few weeks ago. And the stories are the same stories as now. Like it's really like there's
Right.
nothing new under the sun. It hasn't changed. It's the same, um, jaw jacking about the
Uh-huh.
same issues forever and ever. Amen.
Yeah.
And I don't want to do that. I mean, I think I'm not saying that it's not important. I just think that like especially digital media has made everything about, so much about the numbers that it pulls any writing in sort of hyper partisan um, directions. What I really want to do is to talk about people. I mean, you talked earlier about spreadsheet brain. I want to do the opposite of that. And I think, there's some people who are very curious and very open to learning about, the people who are here or the people who live in rural places or people who are maybe doing things in an unconventional way. And then there are people who, there's a center category, which are like people who can be convinced that it's worth investing in people and, finding out, um, you know, what the girl who makes your coffee every morning is up to in her life, and sort of how people are living beyond this like category of like 12 people that we've decided to obsess endlessly about. And then there's another category who I think is not open to that at all, thinks it's unimportant, thinks those people are unimportant, and will always reject that kind of work.
Mhm.
But for me, I really think that writing stories is a way to get to know more about people that I've already decided that I love. And um, I think everybody is fascinating. Everybody has a story. Um, I do think it's a way of sort of like in my own way trying to get back to talking about like what it means to be human. I think that we've kind of decided collectively that that's not an important conversation somehow, and it's like the only important conversation is like who are we, what do we need, what do we want, how do we relate to each other, how can we better understand each other. Those are the questions that we should always be. I mean, really, how should we be living?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to do that in really really tiny ways. And I think, I actually think about it a lot because the pull can be really strong to just go for numbers and get, sort of more eyeballs. I
Mhm.
don't ever want to do that. I'd rather just do it as a side project and make no money from it. and, have fun and feel good about what I put into the world. Than to just sort of engage, just join the circus, I guess. um
This might be a corny question, but do you see kind of what you're doing along the lines of like kind of other folk traditions? Like I'm thinking of like bluegrass music or something, which is very storytelling oriented, or even country
yeah,
music. Do you see it in kind of like that tradition, or do you see it as kind of something else?
I would be so blessed for it to be seen in that tradition. I think my mom and I were talking about this yesterday. One thing that's really beautiful about Appalachian storytelling is that like so much of it is just in the voice and like inflection, and it almost is like a song.
Yeah.
And there are these really stunning Appalachian ballads that I think become a part of who we are. I heard, and I'm disappointed in myself. I'm not going to remember this woman's name, but there's a bluegrass musician. I heard an interview that she did, and she said that in Appalachian culture, and I believe this is true of all cultures, that everything is connected. That faith is connected to family, is connected to land, is connected to sort of the quote unquote proverbial village square, to the clothes that you're wearing, the food that you're producing. It's all this sort of intricate tapestry that's all connected. And I think the storytelling tradition in Appalachia, um, it really is another way of passing on generational knowledge. And um, there's so much love in it. It really, again, is just about like, usually an older generation saying, I care so much about you that I want you to know this. These are the things that you're going to need to know when I'm gone.
Mhm.
And I think, I'm kind of on the other end of that in a way, like trying to claw back some of these stories, trying to figure out, beyond just the like cursory swipe that, we do in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
In broader culture, like what are the nuts and bolts of this thing? And what can I, it's selfish in that way, what can I take from this? How can I benefit from these stories? And is there a way that I can help other people, by passing them on?
Yeah. Do you care to talk about any of the stories that you've written about recently, or that you're thinking about writing, like any
Yeah.
particular ones that you care to share? I think would be.
I'm writing right now, I'm working on a story about wildcraft and kind of the Cherokee tradition, how it exists now, in kind of a hyper local way, and whether that's at risk at all in this kind of like blooming of, kind of cultural interest in Appalachia.
Yeah.
Um, a buddy of mine who, grew up in kind of the hardcore scene, he's always like, as soon as it gets big, it's over.
Yeah.
And, that's what I'm really proud and really happy that there's so much interest. But then on the other hand, it's like, all right, what's at risk if this
Right.
keeps
It
the way?
becomes commoditized, and then it's over. Yeah. Like,
Yeah,
you almost
exactly.
need, like, you want people to appreciate it, but at the same time you almost need some kind of boundary or filter so that it doesn't get exploited.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And I think storytelling is a part of that boundary creating, to say that like, hey, this is not just something that like, and this is not a caricature. It's not like a guy in like ripped up bibs that like, wears a straw hat. He just goes out in the woods and like that's, the fullness of it.
Mhm.
Um, it's part of a I said something on Twitter about this the other day. Like there were a group of people here who, rather than a group of Cherokee people who, rather than go on the Trail of Tears, just like a handful, like a few hundred people, literally walked into the woods.
Yeah.
And the knowledge that they carried with them is everything that they had to go on. There wasn't like, camp waiting out there for them to like take them. It's just like a dispersion. And that's on my mother's side, the tradition that I come from. I could never do that. I would not make it at all. And I'm kind of hyper aware of that. But I do think that like we owe something to the richness of that tradition.
Yeah.
And it's something beyond, um, oh, people learn this from the natives. Okay, anyway, like here's a story about ginseng.
Right. Right.
Like
Yeah.
there has to be something
More than just
that's
an acknowledgement. Like oftentimes in modern society, like with like the land acknowledgement, it's just like it's almost perfunctory. Where it's like, oh, okay, I acknowledge that this comes from the Cherokee, or this is, originally Cherokee land or something. But now we're gonna do whatever we want. And it's like you checked off your signaling box, but you're actually not really appreciating it.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think, that really leaves the door open for exploitation. It leaves the door open for people to do whatever they want to do because they have no emotional or actual connection to it or understanding of it or appreciation. I mean, um, I think for me, to say, my mom remembers my great great grandmother, and you know, she was a child in that tradition. Like that is how she, came up.
Yeah.
And she remembers the way that, the way that she did things. I have no connection to that other than what can be passed on to me.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that, and that's been a really beautiful part of being back here is that you start to get to know, you start to have this like ongoing conversation with your own ancestors and the people that you come from,
Yeah.
that you really didn't know was possible. But, it really like strengthens and enrichens your view of life and yourself and your own tradition. But these people, my mom grew up the first 8 years of her life, the food that they have was literally, mostly what they could find.
Yeah.
And, I think to fail to appreciate that is kind of to be an asshole. Like that's how you get like, these kind of like gentrified neighborhoods and you're like, okay, well, this is an Appalachian themed restaurant, so it must be it. It's like um it's like a cheapening and I mean I hate to keep using this word, but it really is an impoverishment.
Yeah.
And it limits what we can
Pay
understand.
for something that you can pay for, and especially pay a lot for, then it's probably not not the thing itself.
Yeah, that's
It's
right.
people, and this is an interesting, I think, topic of like locals who are trying to make a living, right? And say like, go to sell at the farmer's market or something,
Yeah.
and there's a story behind it about generational knowledge, but then you're selling to kind of like wealthy, let's just say yuppies, not to be mean, but let's just say that, right? And but you're doing that because it's part of how you make a living, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes this, it's in this kind of political economy in the world we are. It's like there's in many ways there's no way to be absolutely pure or absolutely unconflicted. Yeah, well, that's an assertion. I'm curious what you think about that.
No, I agree with that. And I've struggled. I mean, I mentioned quilting before. I struggle with that because I have this sense personally that like anything that's made here shouldn't leave here. And that's not, people do need to be able to live. you, you have to be able to like
Hey,
part of the marketplace on some level. You can't just sort of like, disconnect entirely and you know, I guess to be totally pure would be kind of unto your own demise.
right,
And it is hard though because I bring up the quilting thing because there's this sort of like conversation that's ongoing in that community about these like quilt coats that have become, really popular and trendy, especially on social media. And there's some women who are like, look, I'm not destroying any quilts. These quilt coats are made out of quilts that were already, basically destroyed. Um, but the cost of these quilts is like these quilt coats is like $800, $900, right?
right,
And it's hard, I think, cognitively for people like me to sort of square with like, okay, well, again, like I said, this is something that a woman made um out of necessity and need and care and something that she did for her family. It's a provision. It's a just really elegant provision.
yeah,
And is there some disconnect between, is selling those quilt coats for almost $1,000? Does that lead to more appreciation or is that exploitation? It's a difficult conversation. And, there are no clear lines. Um, you know, one person might have a really deep love and appreciation and care for and tell the story of the quilt and hope that the person that she sells to appreciates that and carries it with her. And another person might be like, I do not give a shit. I'm going to churn these coats out as fast as I can. Like, I don't care.
Right.
It's like, and
The
who
person
could,
buying it might be doing it because it's a speculative asset, which they think will increase, or they actually really appreciate it. And
yeah,
they want
exactly.
to learn. Yeah.
Exactly. You can't sort of, make determinations about people's motives. And if you're trying to sort of buy and sell on that basis, it's going to be a disaster zone. I know.
Yeah.
I feel like I have this very strong sense of justice that sometimes is so misdirected. It's like, huh. But I do think, that part of things it can be difficult. And, at the same time, it's like I see people, there are men around here who really are like master woodworkers, and they sell their stuff so cheap, and I'm like, man, if you could get into a bigger market,
Yeah.
or if you can get into an urban market where people are willing to pay, XYZ for this, it would really help you out. And so, I don't want to be I don't want to be so committed to being pure that I'm disadvantaging people who actually really need, to earn a living from what they do. Um, yeah, you can tell I'm like working through this.
Yeah. Yeah.
but, but it's tough.
Well, given kind of the highly flawed, dysfunctional political economy and just kind of
Yeah.
general situation we're in, it seems, and in the interest of just having to make a living, it seems like there could be this kind of barbell strategy, and something that I think I kind of observe where, let's just say, traditional cottage production, for lack of a better word, is done, both for self-provisioning and as gifts to friends and family. And that's more like the informal economy, but then you still have to like pay your property taxes or whatever, right? And so you do still
Right.
try and have to market it as, to kind of this high end kind of, you're marketing your culture as this kind of value added, very quality product. And, you know, like you can't yeah, like you said, you can't be totally pure, because we exist within a market economy where you cannot be literally self-provisioning in the woods. You'll get arrested, or they'll take your home away because you can't pay your taxes or whatever, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's nothing else you can do, and so you
Yeah.
have to like it. But finding that balance, right? That's something that everyone has to do, has to navigate.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think everybody's balance is different. I mean, there are people who are like, all right, look, I'm willing to live very bare bones, um, to try to do this in the purest way that I can. But I mean, even purity is,
Yeah.
it is a beautiful thing to be able to share your culture with other people. It's just so difficult when, the kind of like marketing environment that we live in is so cheap. It's just like, is it everybody is looking for substance and nobody is finding it. And even when we know we're being sold, I think we're like, oh, all right, well, you got me there, but I'm still gonna buy it. Um, and that's its own can of worms, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know that you probably have to run pretty soon. You said about 60 minutes. What other topics should we explore in, say, the last 10 or 15 minutes of the conversation? What other topics have been kind of top of your mind, or you wish somebody would ask, or bring up?
Yeah, I think the thing that I've been thinking, and I'm certainly not the only person by any stretch of the imagination who's been thinking about this, but this conversation that we've been having, first, you know, first about industrialization, and now really about digitization. I think that in the world that we live in and the market economy that we sort of exist in, somebody has to suffer. And, I think that that's really why my heart is, so closely tied to sort of functional or experiential expertise, is that there seems to be this sense that like if there's a slave class, that's okay, because what else can they offer?
Mhm.
And I think that's true. I look at it domestically, and with the sort of crises that have been created, with the economic decisions that have been made. And an economic crisis, I think, leads to a crisis of sort of self-concept, which leads to, oftentimes diseases of despair, addiction, etc. We've lost in this community tons and tons and tons of especially young men to overdose. And I think that all of the sort of questions that have been asked about that have been, again, very sort of cheap, surface level questions rather than sort of root causes. And I think, any efforts to address the problem have just been sort of like, here's a campaign.
Right.
I
Here's the
think
program.
yeah, exactly. And I think that I really hope that we can be, sort of more serious and more thoughtful about how the way that we live, and I include myself in this, I certainly am guilty of this as well, but the way that we live creates sort of, negative and harmful situations for other people.
Yeah.
And as I said, I focus on that domestically. I think it's true globally as well. Like, we're fully and well aware that our buying habits are creating sort of, terrible, terrible labor conditions for people globally, and even for children globally. And yet we still make those decisions with, barely even nod to the fact that we're, seriously, seriously disadvantaging and harming people.
Yeah.
And I think, I struggle with that. I just, have you ever read Player Piano, the Vonnegut novel?
I haven't now.
So I forget what the documentary is called. He talks about this a little bit in a documentary that I watched about him recently, but he worked for General Electric for a while as kind of like a comms guy, and this was before he'd written anything. And General Electric started automating processes, and they were super ashamed, he says, that they had automated processes because they understood what it would mean for their workers. They understood that they'd be putting people out of work. And they understood that they had basically set a standard in a way for where industry would go next.
Yeah.
So, he quits GE, writes this novel, Player Piano, which is about, just this thing. It's and actually even hints toward, AI, in the sense that it talks about, okay, you think this is just going to be for like classes that you don't care about, but it's coming for your job too. So, spoiler alert for anybody who might want to read this, but basically, there's two striations in society. They're separated by a bridge. The people on the quote unquote wrong side of the bridge who've been displaced decide that they're going to sort of like mount a revolutionary effort to kind of destroy the machinery and get their jobs back. And, it ends with them rebuilding the machinery. And, I think that there's a question about, how we should be living. I think every decision that we make, there should be a normative quality to it. And, I think this is true with agriculture too. There's just this thought that like, this is how we've been living, so this is how we must continue to live, rather than, how should we be living? How are our actions affecting other human beings? But there is this question of like, what is the proper balance? I think, there are very few people who, as much as the return narrative talked about on Twitter, there are very few people who want to live the way that my mother grew up. Very few people who want to live without plumbing, who want to take a bath in a galvanized tub, who want to worry about whether their meals are, whether they're going to get a meal, where their meals are coming from. But then on the other hand, it's just like hyper speed, hyper embrace of sort of everything. I do think we need to be having, on the individual level and on a sort of community and cultural level, a conversation about what is the proper balance and what do our actions mean for other people. And I think, for me, this comes from a faith basis. There's the sense of like what your responsibility is to other people, which is absolute charity. None of us can do that, right? But we can start trying. And I think, it's been a really long time since as a culture we thought about any of these things. It's sort of not a how should we be living, it's we are living this way, so what's next?
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
and I think, for us too, like that can't be good for your soul. You have to to nurture your soul by nurturing other people. And I really hope we can start thinking about that in a serious way.
Yeah. Well, this is a fascinating set of topics that you just brought up that I feel like it's something I think that we try to explore in some of these episodes of Dimmer Optimism as well. How I would kind of frame what you're saying is one, so economists would talk about negative externalities, right? It's a very kind of clean, efficient term, which basically means sacrifice zones. That if you want industrial modernity and economic development, there's going to be sacrifice zones, and theoretically, you compensate the losers. Okay, that never really happens for one. And as you said, like the Appalachian coal miners, in some ways, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but in some ways, it was like the best. It was the best form of livelihood that somebody can get, especially a man could get in the mid 20th century. On the other hand, they're incredibly exploited, right? Most of the wealth either left the region itself. Many of the people didn't even own their own homes. They lived in company homes and shopped at the company store and were exploited. Then there was all the environmental toxicity issues as well. And all for basically post World War II, we could have, a post World War II economic boom, right? Where with cheap electricity from that coal going to like the East Coast and going to make steel and other products that really fueled a good part of the this economic boom. But Appalachia was in some senses a sacrifice zone for that. And correct me if you have a different interpretation of that. But then if we extend that kind of dynamic to the whole world, we live in a highly globalized economic system. Most of our products, we have no idea where they came from. We have no idea, how the rare precious metals were mined. Was it child labor? Was it, basically slave conditions? What were the environmental damages? Destroying the resource base of a region so people had less chance to be self-sufficient overall. It's this, we're in this very kind of horrible dynamic in it. But as you say, return, most people idealize what return would mean, as you say. And so like figuring out, if we were to quote unquote externalize a lot of these externalities, meaning not have sacrifice zones and sacrifice people for these products, well, one, they would definitely be more expensive. So we would have to consume less, but we also have a lot of knowledge, a lot more scientific knowledge and technological knowledge than we did. And so maybe it wouldn't be the same as pre-industrial England or something. But it certainly wouldn't be as consumeristic as today, not even close. But how do we, the whole question of how do we get there, and even can the industrial modernity even sustain itself, right? So the big premise in New Optimism is that it's not sustainable. That a lot of our life support systems in the globalized economy are going to be probably breaking down. We don't know what the time frame is, whether it's tomorrow or in 3 decades, but it's just the numbers don't add up. And so what will that mean to both try and preserve, some of this technological and scientific knowledge, so we're not completely impoverished and worrying about our next meal, but also recognizing that our lifestyle expectations in today's economy are just completely out of whack. And it's such a huge, this is like to me, it's like the huge topic that it's so hard to even get a grasp on, because there's so many different, angles you can look at it from.
Yeah. And I really think that starts with individual choice. Mm-hmm. I think, I guess again, my doomer perspective is I don't think that society will make that choice. And I think that having kind of been in the belly of the beast in DC, I think I don't think that people who are quote unquote decision makers are intentionally exploitive. I just don't think they care. Like as long as they can continue to live the lives that they're living, and gain in power, gain in prestige, be
Mm.
at the right parties, know the right people, etc. And I don't think I think very few people go to DC with that intention. I think it just, it's a Mr. Smith goes to Washington situation. It just becomes what it is. And I think that my view of Appalachia has sort of become, Appalachia by and large, with the exception of coal, has really traditionally rejected industrialization and said like, hey, not we're the original, not in my backyard. Or
Right.
something.
You literally can't have large scale industrial agriculture. The topography does not just not
Right.
for it. So
Exactly. So I don't think, I don't think that systems will move in that direction ever. And I don't think that I think that people who try to make that effort to be independent, I think they'll be, this may be a little too strong in terms of language, but I think they will be punished for it. I mean, whether it's, not receiving benefits, whether it's, lack of recognition, I think the opioid issue, I think about that issue, and it's like here, I've had a number of family members overdose, and the first one was in 2004, and nobody was talking about this issue then, and nobody really cared, and four more family members died in the meantime, and it's like, do I think anybody cares about that issue? No, I don't think anybody cares about that issue, and for me, that has become kind of a signal or a symbol of, like I said, help is not coming. Like if you think help is coming from the outside, help is not coming from the outside. And I guess that sort of carries me to or brings me to the optimistic part of my perspective, which is that I think that the power of individual choice is staggering. And I think that when, individuals start to make the decision, this is not how I want to live, and I think that we're starting to see more of that, and I'm hopeful that we'll continue to see more of it. I think that becomes undeniable, and maybe you don't change the world, but you do change what's in front of you. And I think, I saw, and I'm sorry, this is maybe a little too much emotionally, but I saw this boy, and I don't know if he was experiencing overdose, or if he was, I think he was either dope sick or, experiencing overdose. And it was in front of the store at home, like midday, like a Marshall's or something. And, this elderly lady came and held his hand, and her husband went to the car and got a blanket, put the blanket over him. And, they waited there with him. They stayed with him until the ambulance came. And, you would think that she was his relative, the way that she was, caring for him. That is optimistic to me. And I don't even know if optimism is the right word. I think it's faith in sort of the goodness of human beings, and in charity writ large, that people will make a choice that doesn't make sense necessarily, or doesn't make sense to the external world, because they think it's the right thing to do, or they know it's the right thing to do, and I think that's what we have to hope for. It's something that goes beyond sort of just kind of getting and spending. It really is something that is like spiritual transcendence. And again, that's kind of woo woo, but that's
hey, I'm bought in. I'm bought in. Than most other things. That's woo. Then count me as part of that woo tribe.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too.
Well, that's beautiful. I don't really want to add anything because I think that's such a lovely, poignant way to end. So thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you.
We,
Thanks for having me.
I'm hoping we can have more conversations in the future. I want to offer up, just in case you're interested. Doomer Optimism is kind of like a collective where we've had at least, I counted the other day, we've had 30 different hosts, 15 men
Wow.
ones. And we're always, especially when we interview people and there seems like there's a good resonance. If there's ever anybody that you want to like talk to on this kind of medium, podcast medium, and you want to use the Doomer Optimism platform, I want to make it available. So if there's just somebody that you feel like some voice that deserves to be heard, and you want to be a host on Doomer Optimism, I want to extend that invitation.
Thank you so much. I would love that.
Cool.
I have to talk them into it first.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. For
Thank
sure.
you. That's lovely.
Cool. Well, until next time. Take care.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you.
That was good. Thank you for coming on.
I appreciate it. I hope that I didn't get to like I said, I tend to be a little head in the clouds. So
Like part of my whole journey in the last few years was going from being kind of an academic to deciding, basically becoming disillusioned with that black pill, basically, and now trying to discover, not even rediscover, discover the tangible things. I can't, I still do this podcast with intellectual. I teach at the university, and I do landscaping and developing a homestead, but so I'm still part of that kind of intellectual. I still like intellectualism, but I realize I just need to fucking learn how to like build stuff and grow
yeah,
stuff. And
we're on a very, very similar journey.
yeah,
I
I think you have more roots than I do, at least in the region you're in, which I'm very envious of, but I also really much appreciate.
well, you're growing them. And like I said, I think one thing that was really um, beautiful about the coal industry being here.
Mm.
And I agree with what you said on the podcast. It was kind of a mixed blessing and curse, and it continues to be. That in a lot of ways. I say mixed blessing because it brought in like medicine, for instance, just things that people needed. But something that was really lovely about it that I don't think people realize is that it brought in a lot of different cultures from a lot of different places. And you'll find if you go like, in Eastern Kentucky where my mom grew up and I spend a lot of time, there'll be like random like Hungarian donuts or some shit like in a holler that's like been adopted, from some person who lived there and moved there. And it really is like, even though, it's associated with Scots Irish and Cherokee people, to a large degree. I really think there is room for everybody. Like you can make a home here and become part of it. You're not relegated to being an outsider forever.
Yeah,
So I hope I hope that's how it goes for you.
me too. Well, I've kind of, I'm trying to think generationally. Like one, I'm trying not to be a carpetbagger, but two, my kids, will be from here.
Yeah.
I basically trying to kind of start a tradition and graft onto the traditions that are here, and be as respectful as possible. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't want to get into my whole life story, but my parents were like both the rebels of their family, the hippies, ended up in northern New Mexico, which they were outsiders because it's like Pueblo and Spanish there. And then they divorced and then they moved away. So I've just been all over the country, like where do I fit in? And honestly, coming to Appalachia was like, this feels the most like home, even though I haven't really belonged anywhere. So
That's awesome.
it feels good to be here. But I also know that I have to like, keep my head down for a while. And I don't know if podcasting is helping with that and talking about Appalachia, but oh well.
You probably have already found this, and like my mom says I live my life for the approval of old men, which is really true. But you can find what I've found here is that they're so, and this sounds negative about people my own age. I don't intend for it to be. I know everybody gets like crazy busy. We're all busy, but there are a lot of older people who have so much wisdom who are so lonely and they will just straight adopt you.
Right. Yeah.
Families. I don't have any living grandparents, but I do have people who knew my grandparents. I have, my uncle's 70 now, but he says that he says I need to find some old timers, and I'm like, how much older can they get? But they're like, there's a lady who is in her 90s who's teaching me to make pickled corn, just like really just adopting people. And
Yeah.
the homestead, you have like a really cool opportunity to just give people shit and then trade
Yeah.
and knowledge, which has been really my favorite thing about growing food is some of the stuff that I have grown is stuff that they can't get anymore because they can't grow it anymore, and killed lettuce or lettuce and onions, for instance. Like it's like watching somebody to return to childhood to get some of that.
Yeah.
And you know, they'll definitely welcome you in. You're already more Appalachian than a lot of us just by trying to grow stuff and
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
um
I actually have a neighbor who she's 86, doesn't hear very well. It's hard, a little bit hard to talk because of her hearing, but I've tried to do that a little bit, like bring her eggs or hopefully bring her some crop because she talks about how she used to have a garden, but she can't anymore.
yeah,
And she's
they
alone
love.
because her husband passed away, and um, yeah, it's a there. I think yeah, I've noticed that what you said of like it's all about coming with some humility and coming with a posture that actually you have something to teach. I find your knowledge valuable, right?
Yeah, exactly.
With that
Exactly.
attitude, people are happy to teach you and to tell you their stories. Yeah.
Yeah, that's been, I mean, beyond, I was really, really close to my papa. He died when I was a little girl. And the it's my uncle who's been like, I have space in his garden. Garden is his garden, and I have space in it. But he's it's kind of this like, all right, you come and I'll teach you what I know today, like, whatever. But he calls my papa the old man, and he's like, well, listen, the old man said. And so, I didn't get to have a relationship with him as an adult, but it's like this ongoing relationship that I have with him
Yeah.
because, of like what's being passed down. And, that to me has been, and I have these memories of, I've got a crazy amount of half runners. So I've just been stringing beans, but, that sort of like visceral physical memory that you get from something is like, it's not like anything else. And, if you can share that with somebody else, then they tend to be extremely generous with what they're willing to share with you. For me, I just want the knowledge. So
That's
I'm
a
like everything I got just
that's a good deal. It's like I just have to give you some of my produce and you'll tell me this like wisdom that can't be found anywhere else. Like
yeah.
a great deal for us.
Oh yeah, it's beautiful. And it's but like everybody, I mean, I guess farmers do this period, but like everybody in Appalachia is so wedded to the signs, like to the point of like it really is straight mysticism.
Yeah, yeah. Hey,
But
it works, it works.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I pickled, the farmer's almanac said to pickle when the signs were in the waist or below,
Mhm.
like preferably, the best times to feet, it says. And my uncle was like, "Oh my God, what did you do?" Because I guess
Got that
for
from a
pick
book. That book is wrong. Wow. That's
he really like his tone was like I had just like killed his dog.
gosh. Oh
It's
my God.
like, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Well, that's a whole set of knowledge that I need to learn because I just look online and like, but it's probably all wrong.
Well, if you want to come, I think you're in Asheville or around Nashville.
I'm in the Boone area. I'm like
Yeah.
10 miles outside of Boone.
So I'm just a couple of hours from Boone, but if you want to come, he does molasses every year,
Mm.
and I always invite people. Nobody ever comes, but it is like a really, really special day. And his two best friends, or I say day, it's like a period of days, but the stir off day, his two best friends come. One of them, his name's Teddy, the other's Hatchet, who I mentioned. And they really just talk about like everything. If you have any like they want to answer questions.
Yeah.
So if you want to come, then it's in October. You ever want to come, spend some time with them. I have no knowledge to give you, but they but they have tons. So
Um,
you're welcome anytime.
okay. Yeah. I'll have to see if I can make it work, but that actually sounds wonderful. Um, Funny thing, I actually accidentally pushed stop video, not stop recording. So we can cut this whole after part out, or we could leave it in. I don't know. It wasn't intentional, I promise.
It's totally up to you. I'm not precious about it.
I don't think we reveal anything that would be like unsuitable for camera or anything. I don't know. Well, I'll
No,
leave it in unless if you change your mind and you want to cut this last part out, we can do that.
you
Yeah,
can leave.
I like
It's
this.
fine.
At least I like this kind of funny accident that actually was led to a little bit different tenor of conversation. I have one more
That's
question for you now that we're still on camera. What do you think about like the Foxfire series books?
I think, man, I have kind of mixed views. I do think they're I think the fact that they've sort of like become the Bible of Appalachia is maybe not necessarily great, because I think that people, read them and they think like, well, I've got it.
Yeah.
Like I'm good. I've
I've
accessed
read the
all.
I've read the I've read the Bible of Appalachia, so you know,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, exactly. But I think if people are looking at them as kind of an introduction, or just to get kind of like a cursory
yeah,
view of, what life can be like, I think it's good. I do really like the interviews.
yeah.
I think, the interviews are, I struggle with that because I feel like I inject maybe too much of myself in the things that I put together, and I really don't want to do that. I think to the extent that you can just get the information straight from the horse's mouth.
Yeah.
It's better, it's better to have a sense of who people are, and what their traditions are, and um you know just a richer view of who they are. But
Yeah.
yeah, I do think the Foxfire things, they've become, they're just a trend, and right now, and it's again one of those things that it's like, okay, so that's good, and I'm glad that people are looking at these and starting to gain a better understanding. But like, if that's it, that's not going to take you there,
Yeah. That's
uh,
a it's an introduction. It's not a replacement for the real thing. And so
yeah,
it's approached in the right with the right attitude, then it's good. But if
that's
not,
right.
it's just another, you know,
Yeah, and
mechanism.
the sections are short enough. um I don't know, I guess the way that I see it is like watching like Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown or something. And then if you come away from an episode of that and you're like, I got it,
All
like
right,
you
I
don't.
understand Southeast Thailand now. You don't even need to go there. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, good. I'm an expert now. Like, no, that's not, But then, what I will say is that people have asked me for recommendations about literature about Appalachia, and so much of what's written about Appalachia, and I would say like not just so much, but the vast majority of material that's written about Appalachia is political. And if you come in and you have like a particular political view, or you have like a political point that you're trying to make, and you're approaching people to like either prove or disprove your point, you've already lost the script. And I think that becomes really hard. There's like, I think about this a lot. There's JD Vance's book, which I don't know what people think about JD Vance. I think that he wrote something that I don't know if he intended it to be, although it's called Hillbilly Elegy,
Yeah.
whether he intended it to be like his personal memoir, to be like and this is what every single person in Appalachia has ever experienced.
Yeah.
And I know because my grandmother is from there, even though I live in like a non-Appalachian part of Ohio. And then there's this responsive body of literature that's like, you are an idiot. This is what we think. And all of that's political too. And it's like,
Yeah.
what if y'all just thought about like who people are, where the culture comes from, where it is today, where it should be today, this like rich tradition of like, creativity and ingenuity and just deep, deep, deep human beauty and community. What if you focused on that, and whatever political point you want to make, you can do it in an op-ed in the Washington Post.
Right.
It's hard, I think, to make recommendations to people. I honestly end up like, I tend to end up recommending novels because I'm like, you'll get like, some view of this that has some distinction rather than like, I went to a folk school and I love Bernie Sanders and I'm ready to talk about it. Like, that's fine, but it's just not going to give you any real depth of perspective about what it's like here.
And now I'm curious, any particular novels that you would recommend?
Well, I don't know if I would call this Appalachian, but Wendell Berry's Hannah Coulter, um, which maybe that like in the culture that we live in, maybe that's problematic because it's written from the perspective of this like elderly woman looking back at her life.
Yeah.
But it's stunning. Like honestly, I have no idea as a woman how he captured that sort of like sense of person as
Yeah.
well as it's just wild to me. It's like
Yeah. I was a man.
supernatural.
He was able to flesh out that character. I haven't read
Yeah,
that one. I really liked Jayber Crow and Memory of Old Jack. Those are the two. I'm reading A Place on Earth now. I think
yeah,
Harry Potter was on my list. So I'll bump that up.
yeah. That's awesome. I also really love, even though it's also a memoir and it deals a lot with coal, but Rocket Boys. I feel like um, it's Homer Hickham's, kind of childhood memoir, but the sort of like centrality of coal, what coal communities were like, what it's like to grow up and feel like you're a part of that and also not a part of that, which you know and I wrote about this a little bit, and somebody asked me to write about like stereotypes of Appalachia. Oh, I mean, if I leave and walk down the road here, there will be like 10 kids on their phone on their porch. So, like, how can you know what a place is when the place is being consumed by like homogeny? Like, everything on the internet points you toward be just like everybody else. So, there is this kind of there's this tension there, but I think that the community that he describes growing up in Coltwood, West Virginia, is the community that I remember growing up in. And this like deep, deep, deep appreciation, the thing about coal, the reason that coal is such a good living is that, like you said, it's fucking hard. That
Yeah.
shit is hard. Like working in low coal, like I think I would just die if I had to do that, truly. Like,
Yeah.
these guys talk about like crawling on hands and knees. They talk about like building supports for a mine, like from the mine space. It's like crazy, crazy, crazy stuff. And the depth of respect that he has for, even though that's not the life that he chose and that's not the life that he wanted for himself, but the depth of respect that he has for the men who did that work. And my papa, it's familiar to me because my papa he worked in low coal, he worked the night shift, and he kept a subsistence garden. So what that looked like was, you work all night. Um, when you get home, you don't go to bed. You work in the garden for like however many hours. And then, maybe you sleep for like, I remember he had tin foil over the windows to try to keep the light out. And, he'd sleep for like 2 hours and he'd go back and work in the mine and do that day all over again. And, I don't wish that life on anybody, and I couldn't live that life, but I respect the hell out of any person who will live that life to try to sustain their family. And, in one generation, he had zero formal education. And in one generation, my mom was a school teacher. So in my family, there was my mother who was one, her father was completely illiterate, not able to read or write. She was teaching people to read and write. And to me, that's like, you did it, dude.
Yeah. Yeah.
Congrats.
You provided that generational bridge.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think, I just have so much love for the people here because that's really who they are. They'll they'll create a way for you. Sorry, I'm gonna get emotional. Even if they can't create a way for themselves.
Yeah.
And to give when you have almost nothing to give is like, there's nothing more Christ-like than that. Like, to say, you know, I have this little bit and you can have it. This stunning way to live. Sorry. Uh,
Beautiful.
yeah, sorry, couldn't get through it without some waterworks.
Well, this has been lovely. Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Until next time. We'll actually stop the recording.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.